Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar series. My name is Hala Zahran, and I am the lead for Arab Bank Accelerator. Arab Bank Accelerator is the corporate innovation and investment arm of Arab Bank, which focuses on collaborating and investing in innovative startups across the globe. In today's session, I have the pleasure of speaking with Aanand, who is the CEO and founder of Tala Security, which is an award-winning company in enterprise website protection. Prior to Tala, Anand held multiple product and strategy leadership roles at Symantec, where he built Symantec's first big data security analytics platform, and has led key strategy projects that helped establish the company's vision and strategic focus. Anand also was an investment banker at Morgan Stanley, where he acted as a strategic advisor to leading security software, semiconductor, and clean tech companies. Anand has an MBA from University of Berkeley, California. Anand will speak to us today about how to protect your digital and web assets at the age of COVID, with a special focus on client-side security and its implication on privacy and fraud. Please add your questions for Anand at the end of the Q&A session, and we will be addressing them towards the end. Over to you, Anand.
Thanks, Hala. Thanks for that nice introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please let me know if you're able to see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, good evening and Masa al Khair to everybody who's listening in. Thanks for the very kind introduction from Hala. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about one of the most serious and growing problems in enterprise security, which is how do you protect your data? And in particular, how do you protect data that is being stolen from your websites and web applications? Obviously, we're all living in the age of COVID, and what has happened is because of COVID, our reliance on the web has only increased, and that has made hackers and attackers move their focus, shift their focus to exploiting enterprise web assets. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that could go wrong if you don't adequately protect your web assets, and what can you do to protect them. Hala already did a little bit of an introduction about me, but I wanted to start by giving you guys a little bit of an introduction to Tala, the company. We are a Silicon Valley-based startup. We have been in business for almost 4 years now. We have offices both in the United States as well as in India. We are funded by both leading institutional investors, VCs, as well as some of the founders and CEOs of several large security companies, including Symantec, Palo Alto Networks, Tenable, and many others. And as Hala mentioned, we have been very happy to receive awards in this area. Some of these I want to highlight. One in particular that I'm particularly proud of is the RSA Innovation Sandbox event. RSA is the world's largest industry security conference, and we were selected as one of the top 10 startups to present earlier this year. And in particular, we were the only company that's focused on web application security on the client side. So that is a little bit about us and the company. I want to start with describing the problem. Then we'll talk a little bit about the scope of the problem. And then finally, we will end with how can you protect yourself? So the first thing is to understand that your enterprise data is at risk at the user's browser. Okay, so many of you who are listening in are obviously from Arab Bank and its affiliates. So you're a financial organization, but you probably also work for an e-commerce company or a healthcare company. All your enterprise data assets, traditionally, when you think about data protection in the enterprise, enterprises are focused on data security within the enterprise, within your data centers, within your storage mechanisms, within your perimeter, if you may. And there are a lot of good technologies for that, starting with web application firewalls, DLP or data leakage prevention. Then you can do encryption of data, tokenizations. You have multiple database security products. This is all very good. The problem is if you think about where the data is coming from into the enterprise, almost all of the data that you're collecting into the enterprise comes through the web, right? You have either your employees, could be your users, could be partners, affiliates that are all logging on to www.bank.com or ecommerce.com or developerportal.com. The web is where a lot of this information comes in. And if you think about really where that comes from, it comes from the browser, my browser, your browser, etc. And therefore, the browser is the point at which a lot of sensitive information enters your enterprise. So the question is, how are you protecting the browser today? And historically, this is a problem that enterprises haven't really focused on because, again, for a lot of reasons. Number one, the browser might be a device that your enterprises don't manage, right? It could be a user logging in from home using his or her personal device. So how do you protect that browser? It could be that the user is connecting to a web application or website that doesn't have adequate security controls. The bottom line is, if you think about enterprise data, you want to expand your view from inside your data centers to outside and looking at the customer browsers or the employee browsers. And therefore, your enterprise today is at risk for data loss at the enterprise user's browser, okay? So this is very important to understand. That's what we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation. How do you extend data protection from the perimeter to the edge, in particular to the user's browser? Now you might wonder, what are the implications of this? Well, if you think about all the things that could go wrong in the browser, some of the things that we do on a daily basis are obviously we go in and sometimes it might be an e-commerce website or a financial website. Maybe we're trying to purchase something or we're trying to log in to an account. So I might be entering credit card information, my username, my password, and other credentials. If those data points are not protected at the browser, attackers could have access to my credit card information and my username password. Imagine that this is a sensitive administrator who's logging into their web applications, and an attacker is able to steal that right from the administrator's browsers. That could create problems. It could be a healthcare web portal. It could be a doctor or a patient logging into their web portal and entering or uploading sensitive data. Again, hackers could have access to all of that. And in fact, it's not just data and things like e-commerce cards. Today, your browser can control devices and resources connected to your PC and mobile devices. So for example, today I'm logging into Zoom, and this web application has access to my camera, my microphone, my geolocation, and other things. If an attacker can exploit these web applications or websites, my camera and my microphone and my speakers can be accessed by the attackers as well, and that can be used for lots of privacy violations. So when you think about protecting enterprise data, you have to expand the scope of your conversation to not just information like credentials and registration information, social security number, healthcare data, first name, last name, date of birth, etc., which are obviously considered PII or personally identifiable information. You also have to think about the privacy implications. Again, so the bottom line is your enterprise data could be at risk at the user's browser because of adequate or inadequate security controls. Now, pre-COVID, before COVID, attacks against enterprise web assets were very, very, very common. And almost on a daily basis, we were seeing large enterprises fall victim to such data breaches. One of the most famous examples is British Airways, the well-known airlines. Their website was compromised by attackers in 2018, And as a result of that, British Airways lost over 500,000 user credit card information. So attackers had put malicious code on British Airways' website. So every time you went and purchased a ticket, a plane ticket to somewhere, and you were trying to pay for that, your credit card information was getting stolen by attackers through the British Airways website. And British Airways actually faced the single largest GDPR fine ever levied on anybody. They were hit with something like a $240 million fine. That's the largest GDPR fine ever. But it wasn't just British Airways. We have seen other companies like the Guardian newspaper. We've seen Forbes magazine, healthcare companies like Quest Diagnostics and LabCorp, which got hit with a very, very large breach where they lost over 7 or 8 million user sensitive data. We have also seen companies like First Aid, Procter and Gamble, Smith and Wesson. Most recently in the United States, towards the end of last year, we saw Macy's, which is a very, very large and well-known retailer. We even saw vulnerabilities being exposed in WhatsApp, a messaging service that we use. The frightening thing about these attacks is we found that about 6,000 websites were getting targeted every month. Every month, about 6,000 websites. And in fact, just last week, Symantec came up with a report that said that that number has increased even beyond 6,000. One of the frightening things about these attacks is how quickly attackers were able to exploit these websites. So towards the end of this slide, you can see that the bushfire donation websites were getting hacked. So as you remember earlier this year and towards the end of last year, we had some very unfortunate fires, wildfires in Australia, and there were a lot of donation websites that were getting created so that users could donate to protecting those against those bushfires. In a matter of days, attackers had found vulnerabilities and were hacking those websites so that when you paid donations, that credit card information and financial information was getting stolen. So even before COVID, we saw lots of enterprises fall regularly victim to these enterprise data hacks. And what we have seen is after COVID started, again, about 3 months ago, these have accelerated. We think the attacks have accelerated by at least 30%. Now, why is this happening? Well, number one, billions of people around the world are indoors, right? I'm taking this conference call from home. Usually I would take it from work. More and more people are using online learning platforms, e-commerce to be able to purchase stuff. Around the world, a lot of governments are issuing stimulus packages, and companies are going to their banking accounts to apply for these loans. So there's been a lot more activity happening on websites because of COVID. And as a result, we have seen lots of enterprises fall victim to these hacks just in the last few months. In fact, right up to last week, we saw enterprises fall victim. So for example, because of COVID, a lot of people were purchasing kitchen appliances, and people were investing in fitness programs, and they were trying to buy online fitness programs or online gym equipment and so on and so forth. And so we saw NutriBullet, which manufactures kitchen appliances, get hit right away. In March, they got a big significant hack. And then we saw companies like Tupperware, and more recently companies like Fitness Depot got hit. And then earlier this week, we found out that Claire's, a very large jewelry manufacturer, also got hit. Again, their websites were compromised. So anytime a user went to these websites, the information that the user was entering got stolen by the attackers. And these attackers, there are lots of different groups that are operating worldwide. Some of these groups, we call them MageCart or Magicart. Now, what's happened with the attackers is that over the last couple of years, they have become more and more sophisticated. So for example, recently, we found that the attackers were capable of compromising payment forms by companies like Braintree, for example, which is a PayPal service. So attackers would go in and overlay a fake form on top of the payment form. So when you're going into one of these websites and trying to purchase stuff, you think you're entering your credit card information into the website's payment form, but actually it's a fake form that was inserted by these attackers. So the attackers now have found a way to not just break code, but insert additional content on top of these web pages. So they're getting more sophisticated. So this problem, historically is something that enterprises have neglected, right? Protecting websites is not the first thing that comes to mind. And therefore, as a result, we have seen hackers have found websites to be easy targets of these kinds of attacks. So with COVID in place, our life has gone online. More and more of us are depending on websites and web applications. And therefore, they have become a very, very important asset for enterprises to consider protecting. Now, I mentioned that there is enterprise data that can be stolen as a result of these attacks. Now, when we think about data loss at the browser, two things could happen. You could have data loss because of an attack, because of a malicious attack, where a hacker group, or maybe a state actor is trying to break into your web application. You could also lose data because of leakage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between these two. The first one is the attack. In an attack situation, what happens is your web application, which has a lot of code running on it, gets compromised. So an attacker will look for kind of vulnerabilities in your code. They might find, for example, a cross-site scripting vulnerability, which is one of the most common, if not the most common, vulnerabilities on web applications today. An attacker will find a vulnerability and use that vulnerability to be able to execute code in your user's browser, right? So they're trying to execute code within the browser. Once they do that, they can then steal any information that the user is entering into the browser. So this is a malicious attack where someone has managed to compromise your websites. And we will spend a little bit more time talking about how they're able to compromise your websites. But by the same token, you can also have a leakage situation. So what do we mean by a leakage? So you'll find that in your websites and web applications, there are lots of third parties that are integrated. I'll spend a little bit more time on that in the next slide. But these third parties, it could be Google or Facebook or others, are actively collecting information when the user comes to your websites or web application. If there are not proper controls, or if there's misconfiguration, or if there's some kind of developer error, which are pretty common, what happens is that these third parties actually end up collecting more information than they should be. They have access to more information they should be. So for example, we mentioned that your web applications can now access your microphone and camera. Imagine that you're using a web conferencing service that has now integrated third parties or third-party services. If the website does not control security properly, third parties can also access the user's camera and microphone, which is a problem. So you can not only have attacks where malicious hackers are coming in and breaking your websites and web applications, you could simply have misconfigurations or improper security controls that ends up leaking very sensitive enterprise data to third parties that you're actually doing business with. And throughout the world now, especially in the United States and in the European Union, we have laws against this type of situation. So you have GDPR, which the European Commission has started. But in the United States, we now have privacy laws like California, the state of California has something called CCPA, and other states in the United States are following that. So privacy regulations are also increasing. So it becomes very, very important for enterprises to not only focus on attacks, but also privacy leakages. Now, how are these attacks happening? We mentioned that, throughout the last couple of years, we have seen many, many enterprises fall victim to these kinds of attacks. How has it become so easy for attackers to exploit websites? One of the problems with websites, and there are lots of problems, is that, first of all, your website is running a lot of code. A lot of it is actually JavaScript code. And that JavaScript code could have lots of vulnerabilities. The second big problem with websites today is that websites integrate a lot of third-party services. And these third-party services could be advertising, right? Media companies depend a lot on advertising as a source of revenue. CDNs, a lot of websites use things like content delivery networks to be able to accelerate their websites. You may have marketing tools, right? Your marketing teams are actively trying to drive users into the website. In order for doing that, they're adding SEO or optimization services. They might be adding social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. You may have video content that's getting hosted from third parties and integrated into the website. You may have performance monitoring tools, analytics tools, sources of content like images. All of these are third parties that are integrated in the website. Now, what that means is that if I'm an attacker, in order for me to break into your banking application or your e-commerce website or your healthcare website or even your government website, all I need to do is to break into one of these third parties, right? I don't actually have to break into your enterprise IT asset. I could break into the advertising company or the advertising agency or some part of the advertising network. I could break into your CDN or maybe an analytics provider. And this has become one of the most popular ways by which hackers are actually exploiting these enterprise websites. In many cases, we found, for example, that a big airline company in the United States, they had a chat agent that was integrated into their web application. So when you went to their website, there would be a chat agent, an automated bot chat agent that would say, "Hey, Anand, how are you doing today? What do you want to do?" And then I would enter information. Attackers compromised that chat agent, and because of that, all of the information that the users were typing into the browser was getting stolen. Now, you might wonder, why is this important? Well, Tala did a study last year, and we're actually updating that study again in a couple of weeks. We call that the State of the Web report. And we found out that the average website integrates over 30 different third-party services just for code. Just for code. Not talking about images or fonts or style sheets and other things. Just for code, when you go to the average website, your browser is making connections to 30 other third-party services, right? That means if you're an attacker, you have 30 different options to be able to break into this e-commerce or banking or healthcare or government website or web application. What's even worse is that we found in our analysis that these websites and web applications were exposing lots of sensitive data like username and password and credit card information and first name, last name, street address, date of birth, social security numbers, etc., to 10 times more third parties than was necessary, which means now these websites have really improper controls. And if you are interested in reading the report, this is the website you can go to, or you can go to our website, talasecurity.io, and you can download the State of the Web report that we issued last year. And you can also be part of our email chain, and we can actually, we will be updating this report for 2020 in just a few weeks' time. But this is an eye-opener for many of our customers when they realize that their websites have a lot of third-party services, which now become vulnerable and, in fact, a source of these compromises. So third parties become an important part of your security ecosystem. The second aspect to these attacks is that these attacks are very hard to detect. So I'm giving you a very simple example of an attack and how these attacks work. So imagine that I'm going into your website and maybe there's a contact form on that website, okay? But this could be a login form, it could be a credit card form, it could be a payment form, for example, it could be user registration form, it could be a healthcare information input form. I'm entering my information, in this case, my first name, last name, my email address, my telephone number, etc. And on the right-hand side, we've simulated a compromise. In this case, one of the third-party JavaScripts that was running on this website was deliberately modified. So when the user goes to this website, what happens is that they're entering this information, and that information goes to the website, but at the same time, a copy of that data gets sent to the attacker server. Now, if you think about it, the problem here is the user doesn't know that this is happening, right? The user simply enters information into the form, and once they're done, right? The website doesn't know that the copy has been sent to an attacker because they get the information. So everything happens normally. So everything looks normal. But behind the scenes, the attacker has stolen and created a copy of all of this information and sent it to their own servers. What happens is this happens for many months because the vulnerability is there and the malicious code is running on the site. And in many cases, we find that these websites don't know about these attacks until the FBI or some other local government agency calls them, or maybe a credit card company calls them and says, hey, we found a lot of credit cards coming on the dark web, and it looks like they're all coming from your website. So we find that in many cases, websites were compromised for over a year. For example, I believe it was the Sotheby's, the famous auction website in the UK, their website had been compromised for many months, I believe even over a year, before they found out that in fact their website had been compromised. So these attacks are very hard to detect because today we don't really have good security solutions, or at least until recently we didn't have good security solutions. So the important thing to remember here is that traditional security mechanisms simply cannot detect these attacks, and you might have data loss happening today on your website without even knowing about it. Now, the main problem when you, and again, this is a little bit more technical, when you think about website security, technically speaking, there are three aspects to consider. There is the server side. This is where traditionally the code and data used to sit. Then you have the network. This is a connection, internet connection between the server. And then you have the client device itself, which could be a mobile device on the browser or a PC. Historically, enterprise security is focused on the server side because there was a lot of code running on the server. The device itself was not very powerful. It was only in the last 10 or 12 years that our mobile devices and PC devices have become very powerful, and the browsers have become very powerful. So historically, we focused a lot of security on the server side. We've also rolled out secure transport on the network so that when data goes from the client to the server, you want to make sure that nobody's snooping on it or capturing it in the middle. And we've rolled out a lot of security controls. So we now have security on the server and we have security on the network, but there isn't any security on the client itself. So today, when a user goes to a website, there isn't any protection on the browser side. And that's really the problem that hackers are exploiting. And that is a problem that Tala wants to help companies solve. Now, how do we solve it? So in a nutshell, when you think about all the things that are happening in the browser, we mentioned that the browser is where a lot of sensitive information is being entered by users. We also said that browser is where code can get access to geolocation and microphone and other resources. One of the wonderful things that modern browser manufacturers have done, and this is true of both mobile and PC browsers, is Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, and many of these other browser manufacturers have actually integrated a lot of security controls within the browser. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of them. They are widely available. In fact, almost all mobile devices and PC devices now have integrated these controls. One of them is, for example, content security policy, which is on the top right. Content security policy is a popular web security standard that you can implement on your website. What that does is it allows a browser to make decisions about whether or not to execute a piece of code. So for example, content security policy can say, when you're connected to www.mywebsite.com, the browser can only execute JavaScript code from this particular domain. So imagine if an attacker has compromised your website and is loading code from their own servers. The browser will say, well, I'm not going to execute this malicious code because this is not part of the website's whitelist. Content security policy is a very powerful mechanism that is actively used by companies like Google and PayPal, Yelp, Firefox, and many, many others to actively protect their important mission-critical websites and web applications. We encourage you to think about content security policy and rolling it out to your mission-critical controls. But there are others that are available as well. For example, iframe sandboxing. Iframe sandboxing allows you to protect against malicious iframes. In a lot of media websites, if you're running a media website or news website, you probably depend a lot on advertising revenue. And if you have ads integrated into your website, a lot of times these advertisements are integrated into your website through something called an iframe. Iframe sandboxing is an HTML5 standard that allows you to protect what can happen within the iframe. So you can configure these iframe sandboxing rules and make sure that if the iframe itself is corrupted, that your website is not protected. For example, we saw that the Guardian newspaper was hit with a very famous attack by the Syrian army, which exploited the iframe and defaced the entire Guardian website through a widget. So you can protect against these kinds of defacing attacks by protecting the iframe using iframe sandboxing rules. We talked about the fact that browsers have access to camera and microphone and geolocation and speaker and accelerometers and things like that. How do you make sure that your website doesn't become a conduit for a hacker to take pictures of your users from their camera, to record the conversations that the users are having? There's a new security control available on browsers called feature policy on the right-hand side. Feature policy allows you as a website owner to tell the browser that these are the only legitimate services that can access your user's microphone or camera or speaker, etc. And there are many, many others. HSTS is an example on the left-hand side. It allows you to make sure that when the users are connecting to your website, that those connections are always secure, that data exchange is always secure, and that information is never being sent on the clear. These are only a handful of examples of security controls that are now available in browsers. Website users and web application companies like Google and PayPal are actively using these to be able to protect their mission-critical applications on the browser side and to protect their user data and privacy. The problem with these is that even though these are very sophisticated security controls, they can be quite complicated and confusing for the average website or the average enterprise security team, which is really why we created Tala. What Tala does is that it completely automates the ability for an enterprise to configure these security controls so that very quickly your mission critical web applications can have all these security controls available, up and running without much user effort. So in a nutshell, when you think about the state of web security today, there's a lot of security controls being implemented on the network side. We talked about the fact that SSL and TLS have been implemented on many websites around the world, which is great. But on the client side, we did a study last year. Over 99% of websites are exposed on the client side, right? Browsers are vulnerable and websites therefore are vulnerable. And we find that except for companies like Google and a few others, not many companies are actively protecting it. They want to, but again, these security controls we talked about, even though they're powerful, they can be very confusing and complicated. What Tala does is essentially it brings Google-grade protection to your website. So imagine you have an e-commerce site, or you have a banking site or a healthcare site. Tala will help you implement very quickly in an automated way these same security controls on your websites. Now you can say, look, I don't want to use Tala. I can do this myself. And that's totally okay. If you come to our websites, we will tell you how you can implement these security controls and what kind of benefits you get by implementing these security controls. So some companies choose to do it themselves, but of course it requires a lot of time and effort and resources. But you are able to use these security controls because they're freely available. They're all standards based. So what Tala does is if you instrument Tala on your website, then all your end user browser sessions are essentially protected, whether it's mobile browser or PC browser. Okay. And we completely automate this process. So very quickly, your websites can be up and running with these security technologies. Now, you might wonder, do I care? Are my websites exposed? How many third parties do I have? Am I exposing sensitive user data to these third parties? We can help, right? We provide a free website risk study for your websites. If you go to our website, go.talasecurity.io/website risk study, you can enter information about your websites. And what we will do is we'll send you a sample risk report, and we can work with you to actually generate a risk analysis for your particular website. So I encourage you to go to this website and download the sample report and talk to somebody from our team who can help you provide an analysis to your executive management about what kind of risks your websites and web applications have. So finally, I want to close with some recommendation. I want to give adequate time for Q&A and throw it back to Hala. So number one, I would say that websites and web applications are highly vulnerable. Historically, enterprises haven't really cared about web applications and websites. There's been a lot of focus on network security and endpoint security and user data protection and so on and so forth. As we saw, your web applications and websites can be a massive source of data loss. And so the first thing is to educate your management about some of the recent breaches, the hacker groups that are active, and what are the implications for your enterprise? What happens if your website gets breached? What kind of data can be lost? Educate yourself, your security teams, and then your management about it. The second thing I would encourage you to do is to download the Tala State of the Web report. It's available for free, and it'll give you a better understanding of how vulnerable websites are. This will give you a general sense of how poorly configured these security controls are worldwide. The third thing I would do is to conduct a risk assessment of your own web assets. How many web assets do you have? What kind of sensitive data are you collecting? And how exposed are you? How many third parties do you have? How many of these third parties potentially can access sensitive information? You can do the assessment yourself, but as I mentioned in the last slide, we can help you automate this process and actually do a free risk analysis for you. So I encourage you to reach out to Tala to do that. And then finally, we mentioned that there are all these freely available standards-based security controls. Some of the most popular ones are content security policy and sub-resource integrity, but there are others like HSTS, iframe sandboxing, Spectra. I encourage you to start implementing these security controls. They are free. There's no cost to being able to implement them. As long as your security engineers know how to do it, a lot of leading organizations worldwide are actively doing that. So I encourage you to think about implementing them. And if you need help, of course, reach out to us. And you can email us at info@talasecurity.io, not only to get a risk assessment for your websites, but if you need help understanding what these security controls are, how they can help you, feel free to reach out to us. Hopefully this was beneficial. And so the last thing I want to say is, we're living in a very uncertain time. Enterprise IT assets are actually at greater risk today than ever before because of COVID and all the changes that have happened. Your security teams are also working from home, so they have their strains, their stretch, and web assets, websites and web applications have become a very major source of attacks and breaches. And I encourage you to start thinking about what this means for your enterprise and reach out to Tala for help if needed. Now, with that, I'll pass it on back to Hala, and we can have a quick Q&A session. Hala, back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Anand, for this comprehensive outlook on the matter. Really interesting, and I think as an end user, you don't really realize how vulnerable you are and how vulnerable your data is. On a regular website, you really would think that you are much more protected. We have a few questions. Actually quite a few, and I think I'll just start with the non-anonymous ones, and then we can go to the anonymous ones. We have a question from Mohannad Fode, and it says, how should the bank incorporate privacy by design into our IT systems, particularly when the bank relies on third parties?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for that question, Muhammad. And the key thing is, I think, starting with understanding who the third parties are, right? And one of the complications when it comes to websites and third parties is that you may have a third party, for example, let's say Google, right? Now, Google may have its own affiliates. And what happens is in the website, when the user goes to the website, it's not just Google that's participating, it's also what we call the fourth parties. And sometimes these fourth parties bring in fifth parties and sixth parties. And we call this piggybacking, right? Where the pig brings, its friends into the party. So there's this piggybacking problem. So actually, I would say, Mohammed, the first thing to do is to understand who these third parties are. How reputable are they? Are you using third parties that nobody else in the world is using, right? We find a lot of times that websites are using third parties that, frankly, no other banks are using or no other e-commerce company are using. So why is your marketing team using them? Are they absolutely critical? So the first thing I would say is to take an inventory. And again, we can help with all of this, but you have to first understand who these third parties are, how reputed they are, how secure they are before you start thinking about, okay, how do I protect them, protect myself against third parties? Hopefully that answers your question, Mohammed.
Excellent, that's great. We'll take another question from Brian. Can continuous authentication reduce this risk?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So authentication is really thinking about the difference between authentication and what we talked about is authentication helps you make sure that the bad guys aren't getting into your application, right? So if you have a banking application, you have authentication to help make sure that only authorized users can get into the application. So it's a very, very important security control.
Mm-hmm.
However, what we are talking about is what happens once the user has authenticated. How do you make sure that the information that they're entering is secure? So think about authentication as keeping the bad guys out. And all the things we're talking about are how do you make sure that the good guys, your actual customers, your employees, your admins, your partners, how do you make sure that they have a secure experience? So in a sense, you can think about authentication as the guy with the gun outside the bank, making sure that somebody doesn't get in. And think about us as a security or the security controls we talked about as controls inside the bank, inside the vault, right? How do you make sure that that is secure and that is a safe experience? So authentication is the first step. The controls we're talking about come in after the authentication, and in some cases could be before authentication. So it could be the username and the password itself that you're trying to protect.
Great. We have a question from Hani. Does Tala in any way prevent marketing and remarketing tags to fire on the site, which can result in not being able to collect data from remarketing purposes?
Yep, that's a great question. So Hani, first of all, maybe I can take a step back and explain what a marketing tag is for the rest of the audience, and then we can talk a little bit about security. So a marketing tag, these were things that came about, a few years ago, right? Historically, like I said, marketing teams are very interested in driving visitors to the website. They want to bring more and more customers, potential customers, whether it's e-commerce or banking customers, right? And for doing that, a lot of times they would integrate a kind of a third-party marketing service. It could be a social media service, or it could be something else. historically, if a marketing team wanted to put something on the website, they would have to call the developers and say, hey, I'm trying to integrate this service. Can you add this piece of code to the website? And that took a long time. So today, we have technologies like tag managers from Google and Adobe and Insighten and many others. So marketing teams don't even have to involve the developer. They can simply add whatever marketing tag they want onto the website. Now, the problem, of course, is that they are now a third party. They have JavaScript executing in the browser, which means they have access to information that, frankly, they don't need to access. So one of the things that Tala and the security controls we offer provide is, number one, visibility into what the third parties are, or these marketing services are. Number two, understand what kind of data are you exposing to these third parties. So for example, if you have the marketing tag added on your checkout page on your e-commerce site, we can tell you that they have access to your credit card information and shipping address and so on. If they're integrated on the login page, we can tell you that they have access to login credentials, username, password, etc. And then the third thing is we can make sure that they are not inadvertently or maliciously collecting information they shouldn't. So we talked about leakage. So one of the things that Tala can do in our analysis when we analyze your websites, we can tell you that this particular marketing service is actually collecting all user search queries, or it's collecting first name, last name. So absolutely, we can do that. Hopefully that answers Hani's question.
Excellent, thank you. One other question that I think is very interesting is, what is the standard coverage for large enterprises when it comes to when they have large security teams in terms of this kind of coverage, this kind of issue maybe?
Yeah, it's a very I think it's a new space in at some levels, right? Enterprise security teams are very familiar with network security. They're very familiar with firewalls and antivirus, authentication, and other things. When it comes to web applications and web security, our experience and Tala's experience is that enterprise security teams are still coming up to speed. They're still trying to understand the scope of the problem. They're trying to educate themselves. The more sophisticated companies, I mentioned Google, right? Google is an example of a company that, because of the size of their operations and because of how important web is to them, right? Gmail, Google Docs, YouTube, all the things we use and love about Google, they're all happening over the web. And so they have implemented, in fact, a lot of these security controls were invented within Google. But one of the things that Google is doing is they implement these controls within their own enterprise, and then they start to help evangelize these to other enterprise security teams. So I would say, generally speaking, enterprise security teams are not so familiar with these security controls, which is why I think education is the first step. That's why I put that as a first step in our recommendations.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think this has not been prioritized before? Why do some enterprises not prioritize protecting their websites?
The honest answer is just, I would say, just ignorance, right? Because what happens is that, well, there are a couple of reasons. One is, but what I mean by ignorance is that because these attacks are very hard to even detect, a lot of companies don't even know that they have been breached. So, in the United States, for example, the way a lot of these companies find out is the FBI, which is our Federal Bureau of Investigation, or a credit card company, like a MasterCard or a Visa. Their fraud teams find out that there's a lot of credit cards coming on sale on the dark net. And then they find out that, oh, the one thing that's common to all these users is that these credit cards were collected from www.momandpopshoppingcart.com. And then they call mom and pop shopping cart and say, hey, by the way, it looks like a lot of credit card information that you were collecting has ended up in the dark web. Maybe you have a problem. And then after some investigation, they find out that their website has been compromised. So, until recently, I would say until the middle of last year, enterprises really didn't know about this problem. They didn't really understand the scope of the problem. when British Airways came out and Macy's came out and all these other companies, big companies got breached, people started waking up. So, this is generally true of security problems. Enterprises, it takes them some time to understand the problem, right? Because things are changing so fast. So I would say that the awareness is growing, which is wonderful. And today, I can say that almost all enterprises, large leading enterprises, financial and e-commerce, are actively looking at solving this problem in the US and in the European region.
Excellent. So I think there are two questions related mostly to what you guys do in terms of the proposition that you offer. And the first one is, what is the role of machine learning in the applications of Tala, and how do you control for zero-day attacks, given that there is no history?
Yeah, these are wonderful questions. Actually, the second one in particular I really like, which is the zero-day attacks. Now, I'll give you a general answer and then I'll talk a little bit about Tala. When you think about zero-day attacks, and I come from Symantec, right? Symantec sells antivirus, and they use a lot of technologies. One of the things that security relies on something called signatures. So a signature-based detection is when you are looking for a specific bad actor or specific signature of a bad actor. The other approach to security is something called whitelist-based approach. In a whitelist-based approach, you're not looking for a specific signature. What you're saying is, I'm only going to allow certain behaviors, right? So rather than, imagine that you had a party at home, you can either look at people's driver's license and say, well, am I going to let this person in or not? Or you can say, this person was not even invited. So I don't care if it was a good guy or a bad guy. I'm not going to let them in. That is the whitelisting approach. Tala takes a whitelisting approach, which means that we are able to detect any anomaly, whether it was caused by an existing vulnerability getting exploited or even a zero-day vulnerability, because we're taking a whitelisting-based approach. So hopefully that answers a little bit about, in fact, we wrote a blog about it. I encourage you to go to our blog and take a look at how we protect against 0 days. The second question about ML and artificial intelligence, which are obviously very hot topics, absolutely, Tala uses machine learning and AI in our backend. In particular, we use it for helping provide context. So we don't use ML for detection, because the problem is when you have a very large website like an e-commerce or a site or a banking site, you don't want to break it. You don't want to stop some real behavior because the ML algorithm wasn't tuned properly. So we do not use machine learning in the active detection and blocking. We use ML and machine learning and AI in our backend so that if there's a break, if there's a breach, we can give you context on where the attack is happening, what the attacker is trying to do, and other kinds of information that your incident response teams can use.
Great. I just have two more questions if you have some time, Aanand. One person is wondering, is it safer to browse internet from iOS phone, tablet, or using your laptop? Are threat vectors different from one to the other?
If you're using it, yeah, that's an interesting question. So the focus of our conversation has not been the consumer, right? It's been focused on the enterprises that host these websites. Right. So what can we do as consumers? The bottom line is, if you're using a mobile device or a PC device, in general, if you're using a browser, it doesn't really matter what the browser is, because all these browsers have these security controls and they're all vulnerable to the same kinds of attacks. It's the website that's the problem. It's not the browser that's the problem. Having said that, I think that Chrome, Firefox, and Safari are the three browsers that are highly recommended because they have the latest and greatest security controls. And now Microsoft has become much better. I think the browser that I would recommend that you don't use is Internet Explorer. So rather than thinking about which browser to use, I would say which one should you not use. Don't use unknown browsers that you've downloaded from some Play Store or something else. Do not use Internet Explorer, because even Microsoft is telling you don't use Internet Explorer, right? Use Microsoft Edge. Microsoft Edge has much better security controls. And in fact, if you talk to Microsoft themselves, they will actively discourage you from using Internet Explorer. And this is also a problem because legacy web applications, some of them still have, support for IE, and they will say you have to use IE. And really, that's a bad idea. IE is not a secure browser.
Great. I think to this effect, the last question was about what is the responsibility or the role of the end users in protecting their own data? Now we talked about the role of the enterprise and what the enterprise should do. Where is the customer or the end user from all of this?
That is a very hard question, and the sad part is, when we think about network security, encryption on the web, it took several years. It took, even today, only 80% of the net is actually secure, right? It took us 5 or 6 years to get here. So the reality is the kind of controls that we talked about and Tala can help implement, it's going to take a few years for enterprises to get there. If you're a consumer, you have to assume your credit card information is already in the dark web. You have to almost assume that, and there have been a lot of statistics that say that, at least one of the cards in your wallet has already been stolen and is in the dark net. I have replaced my banking card and my corporate card so many times in the last couple of years, and we know that it's happening through the web. So unfortunately, you as a consumer, you have to just be aware that this is happening, and you have to make the assumption that every once in a while your information is getting stolen. The credit card information you can track because you can keep track of your banking account. If you have a credit card or something like that, you can make sure that there are no transactions. The good thing about this is that the credit card companies will generally make the consumer safe in the sense that they will replace your card. They have fraud teams. So the good news is that you as a consumer are typically, you're not going to lose money. The problem is for the enterprises. The enterprises, if they have a breach, they're hit with class action lawsuits. They're hit with regulatory fines, and consumers stop doing business with them. So there's bad news and good news. The bad news is that you as a consumer, you have to assume your information is stolen. But the good news is that at least financially, the banks and the credit card companies will make you whole. You are not usually financially, you're not looking at a big financial loss as a consumer.
Great. I think we have 2 more questions if you have the time.
I do have time, yeah.
Great. So one question is from Ala, and it says, can virtual keypad protect the data entered in the username and password?
Wonderful question, Ala. So the answer is unfortunately not. In fact, autofill, if you know, a lot of websites have autofill, right? So you don't even have to enter information. It's just autofilled by the browser. Attackers can steal even autofill information. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how the user is entering it, whether it's manually. In fact, attackers can even steal information that the user hasn't entered. So I'll give you an example. Very recently, we spoke to a very, very large and well-known global financial institution. When you logged into their application, the web application was returning my first name and my last name, right? And first name, last name is considered PII, or personally identifiable information, by many geographies, right? That was not an information that I entered. I just logged into the application, and the server was returning my first name and last name, and that information was being directly sent or leaked to a third party, right? That third party had no business collecting that, and they were still doing that. So the answer is, this is not necessarily information that the user is entering. It could be, like I said, information that's returned by the server. It could also be my camera or my microphone, other things that I'm not necessarily actively doing anything about. So the problem scope is quite broad.
Okay.
Good question. Yeah.
The final question we have is, how can we manage or enforce the security controls on client browsers since it's fully controlled by clients?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So the controls that we talked about, some of the controls that I mentioned in my presentation, content security policy, etc. These are controls you implement on your website. And what happens is every time a user connects to your website, that those security controls get passed on to the browser. So you don't have to control the device at all to have these security controls. You implement them on your website. So imagine that you have, for example, content security policy. That's a set of policies hosted on your website. So if a user connects to your website, along with all the request responses coming from the website, they get these policies, and the policies are understood by Chrome and Firefox and Safari and Edge on all the major browsers, and those policies secure the session. So the very important thing, and I'm glad you asked that because I didn't make that point clear, your users don't have to do anything. You implement these security controls on your website, and by virtue of doing that, it protects the users, browsers, and browser sessions. Now, it doesn't protect them when they leave your website. They're only protected as long as they're on your website. But I'm assuming that is really what you're trying to do. You want to protect them while they're on your website. If they leave and go to some other website and get infected, well, that's too bad.
Right, right. Well, Aanand, thank you very much for this really interesting and very educational session. Thank you for answering all of our questions. I think all of us now will go and change our credit cards and try to make a best effort not to have our information be on the dark web. So everybody, thanks for joining us. I would really encourage you to check out Tala Security's website. The report that they have is very interesting. And also, please check out our own website, abaccelerator.co, to find out more about what we do and with the companies we work with. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Aanand, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.